Hello, everyone. My name is Alisha Fisher. I am from the Kawartha Sexual Assault Center as a Prevention Education Supervisor. Now, there has been a lot of discussion about what's going to happen this school year with the university campuses. Are we going back to school? Are we not? But there's one question that always remains, and that is the discussion about sexual violence and what happens on campus and off campus. And then we know that a lot of students will experience some form of sexual violence during their time of post-secondary education. So I wanted to see if there was a difference between what is happening across the provinces. So I have got Robyn from Trent University here in Peterborough, Ontario, and William Logan from Concordia University of Edmonton in Alberta. Welcome.
Hi.
Thank you.
Robyn, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, your role, and what you do at Trent University?
Sure. So at Trent University, I'm the Sexual Violence Prevention and Peer Support Coordinator. In that role, I do system navigation, support, and counseling for any student that's experienced sexual violence, whether historic or recent, because we acknowledge that no matter when the incident occurred, the impacts are carried with that person. And another thing that's really important for us is to make sure that students feel accommodated so that they can do their best while they're at school. So in order to focus on academics, it means that we need to talk about trauma. We need to talk about what's happening in our bodies, the way that sometimes trauma leads to anxiety. Anxiety makes it difficult to be in classes. That's how sexual violence can impact academics. I think some people don't understand the connection. Why do we need to talk about sexual violence, especially if it didn't happen on campus, is because of those impacts affect a student. And then, as you mentioned, Alisha, students are just more likely to experience sexual violence from the ages of, well, students, human beings, 15 to 24. So some of that key developmental time is happening while they're in universities and colleges, and as well as, of course, outside in the community as well.
Awesome. William, do you want to introduce yourself and your role at your university?
Totally. So I'm William Logan. I am the Residence Life Coordinator at Concordia University of Edmonton in Edmonton. And so I am a one-man show here. We're a really small, tight-knit school, so I oversee everything to do with our residents. And as a secondary part of my position, I also provide a role in leading some of our sexual violence prevention education for our campus as a whole. So looking at general awareness and then running workshops on bystander intervention, and then for some of our student leaders on campus as well, how to navigate a conversation where you're receiving a disclosure. And so, working in residence, Robyn spoke really well about how we need to be able to feel safe on campus, and that really extends to our residence halls as well. When you're experiencing trauma in the place where you live, we know that that is incredibly challenging, and a lot of our students end up juggling that at the same time as their courses and their exams and just the stress of being a university student. It's so hard, and so we take that commitment really seriously. We acknowledge that sexual violence and sexual assault probably will happen in residence, but we don't want that to always be the case. So we're very big on acknowledging that it's here now, but we're not standing for that, and we're going to keep moving forward so that we don't have to say that anymore. And that's a big focus for me in my role.
Definitely. It's unfortunate that our jobs exist in a way. We always want people to succeed and heal and not have to deal with sexual violence when they're just trying to get an education. So I want to hear, I guess I'll start with Robyn at Trent University. What is the general vibe and culture in Peterborough, Ontario?
I think that we have to remember how diverse our student population is because they come from so many different places, including internationally. So whether you're from Toronto or whether you're a new immigrant to Canada in general, you might end up at Trent. You might have been born and raised in a small town outside of Peterborough, and that's what brought you to Trent. So because we have so many differing cultures, which is a beautiful thing about human beings, we also have differing levels of understanding of what consent is. We have different people with experiences of talking about sex and consent in high school and even before that. And we have some people that get here day one, they're 18, they've never talked about consent. So that informs what the culture is like, because when we start doing our education, we're trying to get people all on the same page of understanding what consent is. Because if we can understand it, we can prioritize it, we can support people and their boundaries, then we can prevent sexual violence. So sexual violence is 100% preventable. If someone doesn't commit an act of sexual violence, then nobody's hurt in that moment by sexual violence. So that, of course, is our very lofty goal. But until we have that, what our vibe is currently at Trent is that we have some people that think that they don't need to know what consent is, or that all the things that we've learned from and that we've absorbed from our toxic capitalist culture and environment that we grow up in Canada and North America is that you know, we don't have to care about people's boundaries. When you meet somebody, you don't talk about sex, you just do it, and all the ways that movies and television portray relationships, or even what we consider romance to be. If we think about our favorite romantic comedies, what we often see is stalking, harassment, and that's what we see as romantic. So if we need somebody to feel like they love us by never leaving us alone and always showing up when we leave a class, we already are set up to believe some really harmful things about relationships and about ourselves. So all of that informs the vibe on campus. It informs what students are bringing with them, including experiences of sexual violence that they're bringing with them that we try to support them with along the way. So there are some people that don't care. They don't think consent relates to them. When I think about our public education that we've done, and you'll both understand this very clearly, you know, people want to ask about alcohol and consent. And sometimes when they ask about that, what they're trying to ask is, what can I get away with? Like, how much alcohol can I drink before it's considered rape or something like that? And the problem is not to ask that question, but to just make sure that we're having interactions, sexual and not, that are respectful and that are based on people being kind to themselves and to others. And we're not always starting there. So people want to know what they can get away with, and they want to push the boundaries because they feel defensive when we talk about consent, because maybe they start looking backwards. What have I done in my life that has been inappropriate? What boundaries have I crossed? And anytime someone feels like they are on trial, even if it's just a presentation that they're passively watching, we see those defense mechanisms kick into place, because nobody wants to be a bad person. And so the truth is, nobody is a bad person. Some behavior is bad and inappropriate, but people can learn and evolve and have second chances, and also can prevent that if they're more open and curious about it. So we have some people that are just like, this isn't my problem. And we have some students who are champions. We have some incredible student leaders who want to talk about consent, who bring it to their student club, who want to, as a student union member, make sure that their government is prioritizing consent and understanding sexual violence and bystander intervention, so that we can try to prevent sexual violence and also learn more about accountability. So anytime there's somebody there saying, I don't care about this, there's more people there saying, this really matters and we have to talk about it. So I'm so grateful for those student leaders who, you know, hold up our campaigns, who partner with us to work on programming that they know is going to work for their peer population. And I'm so grateful for that vibe, because as far as Trent goes, we have some incredible student leaders. I think that Trent students are next level. I'm always saying that when I'm talking to people across Canada who work in post-secondary institutions. Trent students care. And an example is, we made this Consent at Trent video talking about what consent is, and it was made for and by Trent students. And I've seen that video 1,500 times because I have to show it in our workshops, and I never get tired of it, because what I see is passionate Trent students standing up for something, and what they're standing up for is care and support and respect and diversity, and they're standing up for each other, and it's really cool.
Definitely such a diversity in terms of understanding about consent, and just on so many different levels. But I'll go to William. What is the vibe and the culture over in Edmonton?
Yeah, you know what, it's similar to Trent. And I'm qualified to say that because I went to Trent. And I was a student leader in a couple different departments on campus, including with Robyn. And so when I left Peterborough and came to Edmonton, I really came into it with this idea of like, well, I hope that this is great. And then as soon as I can go back to Trent, I'll be out of here because Trent is so fantastic. And it is, but I was so lucky to end up in somewhere that's also really next level. I think that everything Robyn's saying resonates with me as well. We're small schools. Concordia University of Edmonton has a very small population. Concordia University of Edmonton's population is about 2,500 students right now. And so everyone knows each other, and we're very, very, very tight-knit. And so what we find is that when we're dealing with sexual violence, more often than not, it either is or is masked in confusion about what consent is. And so, if we're talking to a student, we might hear, it's not normal to say to someone, "Can I kiss you?" Like when you're looking in someone's eyes and you feel that spark, you just kiss people. Why would I ask? And they say most of the time they want you to kiss them. Most of the time I can read the vibe right. And that may be true. We don't really know. But the conversations that we try to have are, for every 9 times, let's say if that's the statistic, you were right, there's still that one person who potentially could be really upset or really traumatized by something like a kiss. Something that's supposed to be really beautiful, right? And so a lot of our conversations are around demystifying, like Robyn was talking about, the process of obtaining consent, and how asking, "Can I have sex with you?" and hearing yes is possibly a really empowering experience and something that makes you feel really good about yourself. And how do we make it less awkward to ask someone, "Do you want to have sex with me?" Or, "You're really drunk. Do you want to maybe have sex tomorrow? Here's my phone number," right? These are conversations that we can have. And it's important to be having them. So I would share in this idea that Concordia is also a really wonderful university filled with some incredible students. What I think is interesting though is, Robyn and I are both shared that we go to great schools with great students, and yet sexual violence is still happening. So why is that? Why is it that we have really amazing people as a whole, but all these things are still happening? Where is that lack of education? And how do we fill those gaps? And I think universities are in a really good place to do that because students spend so much time with us.
Robyn, do you know how many people go to Trent?
It's 10,000 people at 2 campuses. So we have the Oshawa-Durham campus that has about 1,000. So that would leave 9,000 in Peterborough.
Mm-hmm. And do you think, William, that the small, I don't know, I tend to think that 5,000 is a smaller number. Do you think that helps in accountability and being able to reach out and support as many people as possible?
But yeah, absolutely, right? Like if we think about online media and all the sexual violence comments that are posted on there and the discriminatory and sexist comments that are posted online, if we go along the thought process that what empowers those people to be hateful is anonymity, the smaller your community is, the less anonymity there is. And I'm not speaking from a research perspective on that, I don't know. But I know that in our community, and I felt this at Trent too, that people hold each other accountable. And if we're looking at specifically a residence hall environment where we have in our buildings about 20 people on a floor, they really do become family in the truest sense, of eating every meal together, walking each other to classes. So this is a group of people where they know each other. And so if something like that were to happen, if sexual violence were to take place in residence, I think that there's a fear that it would spread much more quickly, and it probably would. But then I also think that people are getting to know each other and seeing the value in respecting each other. Our resident students speak to it all the time of how beautiful it is to live with other people who respect you. And respecting people means not sexually assaulting them. And so that's been something really great that we've seen.
Mm-hmm. There seems to be a confusion about what is consent, especially when it comes down to those more intimate connections. Do we think that the unknowingness, the confusion is coming from a lack of education? Do we think it's coming from a defensive mechanism? Robyn, what are your opinions on that?
So I'll start this by saying opinion, let's focus on that. Because my opinion is that there's no miscommunication about sex. It's that somebody didn't care to communicate. And do we need to learn that we have to ask before we engage in something so intimate? It's really hard for me to believe that, because even when we think about just taking off our clothes to have sex. And we can remember that consent is about everything from a hug, but just in this example, taking off our clothes to have sex, to think that we don't need to talk about that first kind of blows my mind, especially because I've seen this, and it's a bad comparison, but about a dog won't eat something if you say no. Like if I show my dog a treat and then say no, that dog will not eat that treat. And so to think that people say no and somebody else still thinks that they don't mean no and we can push that no to a yes, I don't think that that's a lack of education or understanding. I think that's a willful ignorance to not care for that person's boundaries or respect them because you want something. So we have so many sayings in our culture that prove this, like don't take no for an answer. That is a saying that we say, and we might mean that for employment. Like, so you want to get a job and they say, no, we're not going to hire you. Don't take no for an answer. Keep going for it. But if we're going to say that about a job and we have that idea in our culture, we're also reapplying that. We're also applying it in intimate settings within relationships. So I don't want to use the excuse that there's a miscommunication or misunderstanding about consent. I really want to challenge people to slow down, to know themselves and to know their partner or the person that they're engaging in something so intimate with. And in order to know them, they're going to have to communicate. And I've heard Julie Lalonde, who is an important public educator in Canada, and she was talking about how much shame we have about sex. And if we didn't have so much shame about sex, maybe we wouldn't feel like, well, I just need to drink a lot and then I'll be able to express my sexuality and blame it on alcohol later. So again, the issue is so complex. So I wouldn't say that it is, we need to learn what consent is and what the language of consent is, and then we won't have sexual violence. We have to not feel shamed about sex. We need to not feel shamed about our bodies so that we feel comfortable communicating about sex. We need to have movies and film and role models that and sayings in our culture that talk about respect and that talk about boundaries and that talk about safety above all. Don't we want to keep each other safe? But we have this respect in our culture for disrespect, you know, like if somebody bumps up against you, you want to be the bigger person by saying like, you have a problem, you know, or just saying, why are you bumping into me? We all feel so entitled to space and so defensive if someone comes into it, but then the response to that is to sometimes hurt somebody else if we've been hurt ourselves. So again, really complex issues here, but I don't want to boil it down to miscommunication or misunderstanding. I want us to talk about consent from childhood, right? If your family member meets your toddler and the family member says, you know, give me a hug, and the toddler says no, do we respect that or do we push the toddler to hug our family member? So consent education is key in all aspects throughout life, 100%, but I don't believe that it's that we just didn't know what consent was. I think it's that we didn't care in that moment, that we wanted something else instead.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. William, do you have anything else to add to that, to this confusion around consent?
Totally. I think it's, you know, earlier I had said educating students about the nuances potentially of consent and making sure they know that. And, you know, maybe what I mean by that is teaching everyone that consent actually applies to them. Being, you know, and I can say, like, as a white man, right, there's things that I take for granted all the time. And I'm sure I take up space that I'm not supposed to take. And I'm sure that I say things that I shouldn't say. And I need to be told that that's not okay. And so it's a really great point, right? Do students who are sexually assaulting each other know that it's wrong, but they think it doesn't apply to them? Or what is it, right? Is it, you know, they're just thinking like, I have the right to someone else's body. And, you know, I was in a workshop all day today talking about violence, and a really interesting thing came up of this idea that a woman's body becomes the stage on which men demonstrate that they are sexual and that they are powerful in front of their friends. And I thought that was so profound. So if you have a group of men standing in the hallway and one of them calls another one, oh, you're such a girl, you're such a sissy. if he needs to then demonstrate like, no, I am a strong, straight man, and there's a woman walking by, she becomes the stage on which he asserts his power and says, hey, I want to have sex with her, and I'm going to tell her really loudly right now, so you know and she knows and we all know that I'm not gay and I'm a man. And that's so tricky, because that's coming from a place of insecurity, and it's not okay. We can't hurt other people out of our own insecurities. And how do we support people to understand that that's not how we deal with our insecurities? How do we build the resilience to know that the quick, harmful option that benefits us isn't the right thing to do? And we all, if you want to look at it from sort of a selfish perspective, you can go back to this whole don't hurt other people because I don't want to be hurt. Treat others the way you wanted to be treated. So even if it's that simple, I'd like to think that, and I think this is true at Concordia, that our students don't want to hurt other people because they care. But even at the core tenet, right? If you wouldn't want someone using you as a tool to prove who they are and prove their sexuality, don't do it to other people.
Definitely. Sorry, Robyn, do you want to add?
Yeah, I just want to add that I don't remember what TED Talk I heard this from, so kudos to whoever did this TED Talk. But instead of treat others how we want to be treated, treat others how they want to be treated. And that kind of blew my mind because we have come from this idea that if I wouldn't want something, I shouldn't do it to somebody else. But the other way is more about consent. Treat someone how they want to be treated. What do they consent to? What are their boundaries? What is safe for them? What is comfortable? So we need to do a whole cultural shift. Like, no offense, society, but we've just done everything wrong. And I think that William's come up with some really great examples of specifically like cisgender issues, like heteronormative issues that make violence, light on fire. And I think that we need to rethink everything and start fresh in a way. But basically what we're talking about is a cultural shift, and having these conversations is important for that cultural shift, and being open and non-defensive is important for that cultural shift. But it's about really interrogating what we know, what we hold, and how it serves us. Because I think when we start unpacking how we believe something serves us, we'll understand very quickly that it doesn't. So if I believe that that hurting somebody else is going to make me feel better, then I need to realize that doesn't serve me. Taking something from somebody that they didn't want to give me, that doesn't serve me in any way. But in these moments, and at this house party and at this bar and in this classroom, when we see sexual harassment or sexual assault or drug facilitated sexual assault, we're just seeing experiences of somebody taking something from somebody. And it's not about sex, it's about power. Because if it was about sex, then we would want it to be about desire. And if it's about desire, we're going to have to communicate. It's going to have to be like, what pleasures you? So that's what sex is. And everything else is about power, and it's a power struggle. So we have to define what power is for ourselves. We have to stop trying to take our power from other people, take their power away from them. So again, huge cultural shifts and about a really complex topic. And I'll always repeat this. Sexual violence is preventable. So if we can just figure some of these things out for ourselves into our society, then we'll be able to address the issue.
Mm-hmm, definitely. And what's interesting, there's been some research that came out January 2020 that showed the effectiveness of bystander intervention workshops in ending, or at least combating, gender-based violence, sexual violence on campus. And this was down in Kentucky. William, you talked about facilitating how to support a disclosure workshops and bystander intervention workshops. Do you do any other workshops? And if not, why do you find those workshops are the most valuable?
I don't personally facilitate any other workshops, but our institution as a whole does. So our Vice President of Student Life and our Student Life Counselor, who are both some of the most incredible people I've ever met, and so knowledgeable in this area. They also do Flip the Script and some other trainings as well. My involvement is really the bystander intervention for the whole campus, and then the how to receive a disclosure for our student leaders. And I'll talk a little bit about why we do that. And I want to go back to actually, Robyn, your comment about how when a dog goes to eat something, we say no, and then they don't eat it. To continue on that metaphor a little bit, if we've spent, all this time making a beautiful meal and then our dog then eats it, even though we've said no. For all of us, but the most fanatic dog lovers, we're like upset about that, and we maybe in non-violent ways punish our dogs, say no, put them in a crate maybe if that's your thing. And so we really are comfortable with holding dogs to a standard that we don't always hold other people to, especially men. Why do we look at a dog who ate a steak and say, no, that's terrible, go to the crate? And then with men we say, but it'll ruin their life, but oh, did they know better?
It's their natural instinct.
Yeah, and it's offensive though. As a man, I'm fully capable of not sexually assaulting people. I'm fully capable of it. I have all the tools and resources that I need to not be a sexual perpetrator. And so why do we do those workshops in specific? That's where I'm going with this. We really outline very clearly in our workshops of this is what consent means, and this is our policy. And we really believe that people in our community are good people and they have the resources to hold themselves accountable. So we've told you what you need to do. So there's no saying that wasn't clear. We've said very clearly what it is. And then we believe that men are not dogs, and we believe people have the capacity to not sexually assault each other. So if you choose to, despite that, we're holding you accountable to it, and we're believing survivors, and we're supporting survivors, and we're holding people accountable to the very reasonable expectation that you don't sexually assault anyone. And so we do keep it simple, because we believe that our students can handle meeting those expectations.
So Robyn, one thing that you mentioned too is about teaching toddlers yes and no, and the ability to decide what's important for them or not. And, when we talk about consent, there's a lot of pushback to, we should never talk about consent to young people because there's this idea that consent means sex, but really consent is an everyday part of our lives. And so why do you think it's important that we start young?
I think it is about boundaries, like you're saying, because that's where we draw the line. Am I comfortable with this? Do I feel safe with this or not? It's based on boundaries, and every single human being has value in and of themselves and deserves their boundaries to be set and maintained and respected. So the thing is, we don't have to invent this. People have written books for kids about consent. This is an important topic that has already been addressed. So I think it's just about implementing that work that's been done and having important conversations. I think that a lot of educators, a lot of researchers, psychologists have already done the legwork, done the research to figure out how do we talk to this age group about what consent is and what it means. And again, I'm going to be really strong in this. That's why there's really no excuse. Like, information is out there. And at least if it becomes available to anyone, that they should be open to receiving it and implementing it in order to support their children and then the whole society. So consent is about boundaries. And when we only talk about consent as about sex, it feels too scary. It feels too intimate, or we get defensive, like I said before, because we feel like, oh no, maybe we've wronged somebody else, or it brings up previous moments of, oh, that was wrong for me too. And so if we think about consent with boundaries every time, then we'll be able to have a broader conversation and be able to learn how to respect ourselves and each other. I think some of the conversation about consent is about how do you respect somebody else, but it has to start with us. How do we respect ourselves and our bodies enough to share what we want, to share what our boundaries are, and to ask for consent so that someone else can give that consent.
Definitely. Anything to add, William?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that we see the impact of not feeling like anyone's given us the opportunity to say no to non-sexual things all the time. There's a really great college humor video, but essentially what it is a guy is saying like, hey, I'm having a party this weekend, and all these people come up with these outlandish excuses about why they can't go to the party. And then one woman says, like, I just don't want to go to the party, so I'm not going to go. And they're all like absolutely flabbergasted that she could say no to going to this party. Like, society tells us we have to be pleasing, and especially women, I think that's what I hear. We have to be pleasing. We have to give people what they want. And so if we can't say no to something like a party, and then in a situation that's really tense sometimes and potentially you feel threatened, how do we expect people to say no to sex where the risks of saying no maybe are so much greater? And so yeah, I totally agree. We need to be able to create spaces where people can say no to anything they want.
So for Robyn, why do you think that sexual violence is so prevalent with this particular age population?
I think this is a really complex question with a complex answer. And it has to do with what's happening developmentally in that stage, you know, in terms of neuropsychology and how our bodies are developing in that age. But I also want us to think about this could be the first time that a young adult, and I say that with a grain of salt, some people are 17 when they start their first year of university. This is the first time that they've been away from home. So the restriction of curfews and responsibilities and chores and all of those things go from 100 to 0. And so what does that do for a person to have that much freedom? And like what we're saying about, if we haven't learned this earlier about boundaries, about making room for no, about all of these things, if we don't focus on it, then when we go from 100 to 0, that amount of freedom feels like, well, I can do whatever. I think there's a little bit of a feeling of invincibility. Nobody's watching me. There's no authority right now. But that calls into question, are we trying to be good people because there's an authority to hold us accountable? Or do we want to be a good person for ourselves and for each other? That's why, again, it goes to, it's not about misunderstanding or not knowing. It's like a willful act of not caring about responsibility and about the accountability that needs to come after. So that's just one point. Another point is how much alcohol and drugs are available for the first time, again, because of a lack of supervision in a way, or because of that autonomy that a young adult entirely deserves. But if it hasn't been something that they've thought about making choices for themselves first, then the amount of peer pressure that's present, the amount of wanting to belong, which is such a great thing. We should want to belong and be part of this culture at university. But when it shifts to being part of a culture that's a drinking culture that's maybe different from what I experienced when I was 15, then how am I going to adjust to this now? No supervision, everybody drinking. And again, it's a cultural trope. It's like you're at university, party your face off. It has to be these big keggers and all these sororities. And I didn't even know Trent had sororities and fraternities because that's something I'd never cared about personally. And it's just a different culture than like the Greek system in America. But I could go on a whole rant about that. But there's just this story about what being in university is supposed to look like. And think about the movie American Pie. Like people needed to like lose their virginity or something before college. All of those tropes create these timelines in our lives that have nothing to do with us. It's a story. It's a narrative. It's something that, you know, capitalism is selling us so that we consume stuff. I'm not going to get into that either. But the point is that it's something that we have to interact with. And if we don't interrogate it, it becomes our timeline. So, okay, I'm unsupervised. My culture has changed. I'm alone and I want to belong. And these are my peers. And at that developmental stage, peers matter more than anything else. So what kind of peer pressure is there going to be? To drink and do drugs, perhaps? To have sex, perhaps? And what that turns into in somebody's life is going to be different based on their personal experience, based on their goals, and based on who they're with. Sometimes somebody feels like they've gotten into a bad crowd for whatever that means. We can't blame other people for our own behavior, but we can understand that the influence of that is something that we need to figure out and create better boundaries with. So that's just a few of some of the, I think, themes that influence why this age population is so at risk. But I also just want to make room for the fact that it's often young girls being abused, assaulted by older men. So I just want to say it's not always student to student violence, and sometimes it's a community member. So I feel safe to say, because this I think is a public health issue, that Peterborough has a long history of community members drugging, like with date rape drugs, female students at bars. And I think it's so dangerous, and I think it's so prevalent, and I don't know if it makes the news. And so I think that's a public health issue, and I know it's not just happening in Peterborough. And I also want to say, of course, anyone can experience sexual violence, anyone of any gender, race, ability, education level, and anyone can perpetrate acts of sexual violence. But when we look at the numbers locally or globally, we're going to find that most often it's, again, 15 to 24-year-olds, and it's often young women who experience sexual violence, and 99% of predators of sexual violence are male, regardless of what the gender is of the person experiencing that violence.
Definitely. William, do you have anything to add as to why you think sexual violence is so prevalent among university students?
Yeah, what I would say is I am also still university age, and so I don't know that I have an opinion on this that would be much more than conjecture. But what I will say, as a non-expert, but just someone who's also still really going through those formative years, and this is why I quote a lot of experts a lot, because I think that's how I learn and how we learn it at this age, and develop our opinions. But Glennon Doyle has a really good quote that's just do the next right thing, and that will take you home. And I think that's the advice that I try to live by, and that, for everyone who's going through these formative years, when there is drugs and alcohol, there is a lot of pressure that's so tough to deal with sometimes. I just try to focus on what's the next right thing, and what's the easy thing that underpins that I'm considering doing instead. And sometimes I get it totally wrong. Like I'm happy to say that. And not speaking about sexual violence, but just in general, like it's tough to always make the right decisions. But do the next right thing one time after the next, and eventually you'll get there. I think that's what I can share.
Definitely. And with how prevalent sexual violence is, maybe Robyn can speak to this. I know there was a student voice survey that went out across Ontario, and there tended to be some really not so good averages. Did you want to expand on that, Robyn, and then maybe add in some intersections of what's happening at Trent University?
Sure, I have the stats with me. So 30.6% of respondents of the survey said that they reported non-consensual sex, putting us fifth highest in the province. So 30% is 1 in 3. That is really high. And we can't make a hierarchy of sexual violence and put one as worse and more important, but we can understand the amount of risk and strong action that goes into non-consensual sex, right? It doesn't just happen like I pretend that I accidentally touched somebody. It's really quite intensive. So the amount of boundaries that a person has to cross in order to get to that point is really scary. And because we care about people's safety and we care about their wellness, that's why it's important for us to have this survey and these stats for us to understand what people are facing. And 68% reported experiencing sexual harassment, again, putting us fifth. And sexual harassment can be anything from verbal to touching, like I mentioned. And that's really scary. So the good news about that is that at Trent, we're seeing a lot of bystander intervention. So if 81% of people who responded to the survey witnessed sexual harassment, of that, 75% saw bystander intervention. And that's the second highest intervention rate in Ontario. And that is what drives me. Like, that is what I want to see in terms of changing the culture. Because until people stop committing acts of sexual violence, what I want to see is that we catch it early as a society and hold each other accountable. And it could just be saying, like, no, that's not cool, right? That's, no, that's not cool. It's like less than 5 words, and it's a way to prevent something from escalating. Of course, when it feels safe to do so. And when it's not safe to do so, in bystander intervention, we say, call for help. There's very few times where there's nothing we can do. So we need to find moments that we notice that are not okay because we're looking, because we're paying attention, because we know what's not okay. And then we need to know the tools of how to intervene.
To add on to what Robyn's saying about, call for help, I think, sometimes it can feel, and I've heard this from students quite a bit of like, oh, isn't it kind of drastic to call campus security? Are they going to come like arrest people? And that's probably not going to happen. Most campus security guards don't arrest people because they're not police officers to begin with. But also the person who's going to pick up the phone really wants to hear from you. As someone who works in an on-call system where I respond to emergencies in the middle of the night, if I get a call at 3 a.m. from one of my staff saying, listen, someone's just been sexually assaulted, I'm not upset that I've been woken up at 3 a.m. I'm so, so, so grateful that someone felt like they could trust us and they could trust me and that we can be there for them. And so this is, I think, is just a call out to that, call for help in an emergency, or if you just need it. We want to hear from you, and the counselors in your community want to hear from you, and the security wants to hear from you. It's never an inconvenience. And I know that there's a lot of reasons why people don't reach out for help, and it's so valid. I just want you to know that if one of the reasons why you're not is because you're worried about bothering us, there are so many people in your community who will not be bothered and will be so honored that you came forward. So if you want to, and if you're comfortable, please do. And there will be a voice that will, actually a set of ears that will listen instead of do the talking. We will hear you.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned security, you mentioned local counselors. Who can you call to, whether you witnessed something or you've experienced something? And I know it's going to be a little different for each university, but who are some general folks that you can contact if you've witnessed something or even experienced something?
So I would say, I'll speak just briefly to Concordia University of Edmonton for our students who are watching. We have a student success center where it's just one room and then all of our staff are there. So that's really great. And you can walk into that room and approach any single staff member in there and say, I need to talk to someone because something's happened. And there's 100% chance that they will help you. And I think, some general advice for students who are looking for support is to know that your university, if I think that this is true for all universities, but particularly if you go to Q or Trent, your university has a sexual violence policy. And I'll leave it to Robyn to talk about Trent, but all our schools have sexual violence policies or have people who are aware of it. And so maybe you don't know who that person is, but there's probably something on the website. And if you don't know who that person is, reach out to someone who has sexual violence in their title, maybe. Or email the vice president of student life at your university. I think that sometimes that can be scary. But if you go right to the person who knows the information, they'll direct you, and you don't even have to disclose what it's about. But don't be afraid to just reach out to whoever you see and whoever's available who's a staff member, and they'll figure it out. They'll be either able to help you or they'll know who will.
This is a lengthy list and I'm going to forget somebody, and no offense to them. So we're trying to make as many points of contact understand how to receive a disclosure. So we actually had Alberta come out to Ontario and train 20 of our staff in sexual assault first responder, so that they, like CPR and having those first aid skills, are able to respond. So in this case, you can disclose to academic advising, housing, First People's House of Learning, faculty, other staff. Yeah, I am forgetting a lot. You can go to anywhere in student affairs, so whether it's the orientation leader or somebody who runs our rebound program, which is a retention program. Any of those people are trained to receive disclosures, and as well as counseling, health services, and student accessibility services. So we have an extensive Trent Student Wellness Center program, and lots of staff there who are able to receive disclosures and to respond in a good way. And it's not about making sure to say the right thing. It's just trying to be there to listen with compassion and empathy and to support survivors. So at Trent, we believe survivors. It's not up to us to investigate or to try to understand more or get more details. Our job is to be grateful for that disclosure and to support that person in a way that works for them. And then there's me. So I might be the first point of contact if a student has experienced something, and if they go to the website first. I don't know how many students do that, but if they did that, then they would find me pretty well, and they can disclose to me. But otherwise, it's often that they're disclosing to someone that they trust. It might be their professor. It might be their don in housing. And we just want to get as many people who work and live at Trent to know how to get to what they need, and that support is available to them, and in a way that works.
A lot of people that access the Kawartha Sexual Assault Center typically say that we are not the first person that they've told about their experience with sexual violence. And what has essentially derailed their willingness to get that support is because that first person didn't believe them. So if someone's listening right now and they may have someone coming forward and talking to them and disclosing to them about either trauma or some form of sexual violence, and start with William, what are some key things to say or to do, or what can you do if someone discloses to you?
Yeah, the number one thing is believe them, right? To experience something that's so, potentially violating and upsetting, and then have someone doubt that you're experiencing something that you feel probably everywhere in your body, maybe, or maybe you don't feel at all, but you think you should be. To be believed, I feel is the number one thing. And, if I'm meeting with a student who's experienced sexual violence, and I say, I believe you, there's no other statement that I've ever made that I see the sort of immediate reaction of maybe a weight's been lifted off their shoulders. I'm not alone in this moment. And, I'll speak to the idea that, there might be people listening who think, well, what if I don't believe them? And I would encourage you to, because I think, Concordia University of Edmonton and a lot of folks believe that this isn't something people lie about. We don't believe that people lie about being sexually assaulted or experiencing sexual violence. So I would encourage you to believe them, but if that's not something you can do, what I would say is sort of a backdrop to that is recognize your role in the community. So we have people in our communities whose role it is to investigate sexual violence claims and investigate students and lay charges and those types of things. We have people who do that, and you don't have to do that. Your job in the community is to be part of the community. So if the person in front of you says, I'm really upset, sexual violence happened to me, you can just, if you don't believe that what they're describing is exactly sexual violence, or it doesn't fit into the box you have in your head, just believe that they're upset and that they're going through something really terrible, and let that be enough to empower you to be there for them. So at the very least, believe that they're not okay if they're telling you that, and get them to a resource if it's not the conversation for you at the time. That's okay too. But if you can, believe them, because I believe, and our institutions believe, that people don't lie about being sexually assaulted.
Something that I say to folks is that, you're not being paid to be a judge. Mm-hmm. Therefore, don't judge. Be there and support them, and also for yourself to research how trauma impacts the brain, especially the memory functions. And so that's kind of a call out I'm putting out there for you folks. Robyn, what do you have to add to receiving a disclosure?
Yeah, I agree that it doesn't cost anything to believe them, but it costs a lot if you don't believe them. And like you said, it closes off other channels for them to receive the support because they think that no one will believe them. And I think that at any point in any of our lives, there was a time where someone didn't believe us, whether it's about like the dog ate my homework or something. And we can all relate to that feeling when someone doesn't believe us. It's really isolating. So besides believing somebody, I think it's important to say thanks for sharing, because for someone to trust us about something that's so violating, so intimate, I think shows a great deal of respect and opportunity, so there's an opportunity to connect there. So to say thank you, I think is important. I also think that we can say, I'm here, I'm listening, and just be present. Again, it's not about saying the right thing. It's about what you're doing, right? Are you putting down your phone and you're saying, I'm here, I'm listening, and then really showing that? There's other ways that we can believe somebody by giving them eye contact if that feels comfortable, and just being present with somebody. It's not about touching them or hugging them if that's not, because that could be violating. That might not be something that they want. So we need to still have consent and boundaries in that experience, but we don't need to tell somebody what to do. A lot of people say, you have to go to the hospital, you have to go to the police. And to that I say, you're saying that, but you're not the one that has to go. So that's like big words from somebody that doesn't have to deal with the consequences of going to the hospital or going to the police. So Again, we don't want to be told what to do. We don't want to tell other people what to do. They don't need that. So we have to be respectful. You might say, can we look up together what resources are available? Would that feel helpful for you? What does support look like for you right now? So that they can make their own choices, right? You can be a helper. I know that people love to help, and that's so wonderful, but see how they want to be helped. See what help looks like to them when they're ready. But in this moment, I believe you. I'm here with you. I'm so sorry that happened. It's not okay. It's not your fault. Thank you for sharing. Some quick tips like that, but it's just about trying to build some empathy or compassion to connect with that person's experience and to take it seriously in that moment. Another suggestion is just to not label it for them. So if someone's describing their experience, but they might not be using specific terms or words that you would have, it's not your job to tell them what has happened to them in their life, to their body. They might not be able to say it right then. They might get to the words when they're ready, or the words might not be helpful for them. So again, it's just about being present.
Yeah, I've worked with students before who have described to me a scenario that to me sounds a lot like sexual assault, and they don't label it as that. They're not upset about it at all. They're just sharing a story, and in that moment, like Robyn's saying, is not labeling it for them. And the reason why that's important is because maybe right now they don't feel that it's sexual assault, and maybe they never will. That's totally okay. But down the line, they might realize, wait, that doesn't feel okay to me. And if you at that time were judgmental about how they felt about it, or trying to put your own meaning onto it, you're not going to be a safe person for them to come to. So creating that space where you accept people and meet them exactly who they are and where they are means that if that changes down the line and they do start to feel upset, you're someone that they'll actually go to. And so it might do a lot more good in the long run to let someone not be upset about something. And then down the line, maybe they will be and you can help them, or maybe they never will be, and that's great too.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I always add to, educate yourself about some local resources. Mm-hmm. And you can say, here's this number if you want to call them as well. Like, just knowing who are those local resources, who can I talk to with XYZ, or maybe I don't know about XYZ, but who's someone I can contact that can connect me to XYZ. So it's super important to also educate yourself on this. William, if anyone has any more questions or wants to contact you, how can they do so?
Yeah, totally. So I would give two answers to this. The first would be if it's a Concordia University of Edmonton student who wants to reach out about sexual violence in the community. They have a lot of different options. They're welcome to email me. And my email is william.logan@concordia.ab.ca. And then I would also really encourage them that if they wanted to, they could reach out to our Vice President of Student Life, who is, like I said earlier, one of the most incredible people and will support you beyond belief. She's so fantastic. And you could contact her, vpsll@concordia.ab.ca. And then if it's just a random person who wants to be my friend, I love that. I'm able to be contacted at williamwrlogan@gmail.com. That's pretty much it, yeah.
So you'll see my name at the bottom of my screen. So my email address is robynocean@trentu.ca. And you can also email consent@trentu.ca. And you can follow us on Instagram, consent@.
Definitely. Thank you both so much for coming on and having this conversation. And, the thing with sexual violence is that we like to believe that it's not happening in our area, that it doesn't happen here, that sexual violence happens in those urban areas, in Toronto, in Calgary, etc. But it's really impactful to hear that two universities across the country do have similar experiences, and even with a larger population versus a smaller population, that unfortunately sexual violence is prevalent, and that it takes really incredible people like all of our students to come together to end this, to have a community that stands up to sexual violence and says, no, this is not going to be okay. So I thank you both so much for coming on and having this conversation.
Thank you.
And if you want more information about the Kawartha Sexual Assault Center, you can check out all our various social media accounts, whether that's Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, or TikTok, or just head on over to our website, kawarthasexualassaultcenter.com. Thank you for joining us.